Critics are raving. The year of Wonder Woman continues.
I am Dr. William Marston, creator of Wonder Woman.
On October 13th, meet the women.
I think you long for an unconventional life.
Who inspired the phenomenon.
Brilliant, pure of heart, ferocious. Wonder Woman is you, the both of you.
And never boring.
Professor Marston and the Wonder Women. Rated R. Everywhere October 13th.
Hello, I'm Diablo Frank. With me is Paquita Trotamundos. Today we'll be looking at the recently released docudrama Professor Marston and the Wonder Woman. We'll also be getting an overview of the life of William Moulton Marston, Sadie Elizabeth Holloway Marston, and Olive Byrne.
They all started on the 1920s. William is a professor at Harvard, and Elizabeth is there trying to get her PhD, and is just kind of like in the classroom, and Olive is one of her students. Then they offer her a job because they noticed that the professor was getting a little bit interested in her. They both psychologists, so they wanted to, the way I see it, experimenting with this person, Olive. So she started working with them as a teacher assistant. Right out the bat, the wife started saying like, oh yeah, you don't sleep with my husband. And it started creating that drama between the husband, wife, and mistress without saying too much. But then they start showing about how Olive started developing feelings towards Elizabeth, the wife, and at the same time about the husband. So trio relationship, they started going into having sexual relationships between all three of them, and then they started procreating children, two each. And they decided to all leave together. The university find out about the weird relationship between Elizabeth, Olive, and the professor, so he got fired. So he started doing like little jobs here and then, and Elizabeth is forced to take a secretarial job, although with her qualifications, I mean, she has different master's degrees and she's very educated.
At one point in the movie, they make it clear that William believes that Elizabeth is smarter than him, and she agrees.
So she started taking this jobs as secretary because that's the only job she can get at that time, because being on the 20s and the 30s, and she's a woman, so she cannot get a job as a professional because that's kind of like a men's world. And they all leave together and they go into creating Wonder Woman, and what the movie portrays is that Wonder Woman is a mixture of Elizabeth and Olive. That's how Wonder Woman created. And throughout the movie, they start showing different symbols of Wonder Woman, like Olive always wearing those bracelets. And one of the things that I pointed out to you, Frank, is when they were inventing the lie detector, they wrap around a cable that I guess measures your heartbeats. The lasso of truth. It's gonna look like when they wrap it around you, and then they start seeing different images throughout the movie leading into the creation of Wonder Woman. And one section of it is when they are experimenting with sadomasochism, with submission, and they have Olive dress like Amazon, and then they start playing with the robe, symbolizing more like the picture of Wonder Woman as we know her today. The movie goes into the different problems that they have with the family, leaving the husband, wife, and the mistress in the same house with the same kids. And they pointed out that Elizabeth and Olive, they're also in love, so they all love each other like a big happy family. But then they start creating problems within the neighborhood, and the kids being attacked because of not understanding the relationship.
Society rejecting those dynamics.
Yeah, so Elizabeth said, you know, that's it, I'm not gonna go through this. So she kicked out Olive from the house, and then when William is dying, they decided, yeah, we need you, we love you, please come back to us. So they came back together, and so Professor William dies, and at the end, Olive and Elizabeth are living until they die. Well, until Olive died first, I think.
To the degree that you're familiar with the history of these people behind the creation of Wonder Woman, how accurate would you say it was, or what do you know about the actual history of the people?
As soon as we come back from the movie, me and Frank, when we go to the movies, we also discuss afterwards in depth about the movies, and because he told me already that I was going to be part of this podcast, so we did not talk anything about the movie, and as to have that burning desire of knowing more or asking questions about Wonder Woman, because because I am not too familiar with the actual comics. So I know the Image, I know Wonder Woman, I know the cartoons, magazine, comics through Frank. I don't think I ever read more than 2 or 3 Wonder Woman comics in my life. So the first thing I did when I came home, it was to go to the website and start looking at the story, like how true it was. And right out the bat, the first thing I read was Wikipedia about the movie. And Wikipedia, it says right out the bat, I think it was one of the grandchildren of, I don't know if it was Olive or Elizabeth's kids. She was saying that this movie was all non-true, that Elizabeth and Olive were not lovers, they were just friends, and that the producer or the director of the movie, for which it is a woman, the granddaughter, said that they never at any point interviewed the family to know what really happened or did not happen, and she maintained the story of it was more like a sisterly love more than lovers, a sexual relationship. I don't know too much of the history, and I don't think because I kept reading like different articles about the movie and about the life of these 2 characters. It goes into 2 different points. Point number 1, let's say for sake of argument that they were actually lovers, for which it will make a little bit more sense that why Elizabeth, being a very, very strong, intelligent woman and very sure of herself, and one of the feminists trying to fight into the civil acts of the woman liberation, is accepting a lover, the husband's lover, to leave with them. So I think in my mind it makes more sense that they were lovers, that there was some kind of love, and not just gonna be submissive into the husband saying, oh, you have a lover, okay, I'm just gonna eat my words and not say anything and just gonna be okay with it. Because I don't see Elizabeth, as I've been reading to it, and I know her by knowing her credentials throughout the web, that she just accepted. I don't think it was more like a sisterly love. Let's say that they were actually just friends, that they were not sexual desire, there was no like sexual love, then it just doesn't match. It just doesn't fit the fact that, oh yeah, you are a guy, you have a lover, and just because I am the wife and I'm submissive, I have to accept it and welcome this person to our home. That doesn't fit with the description of Elizabeth. Now with Olive is different. I don't know if it's this in real life. She came from a family of true activists, feminist people, but she was raised in a convent, so maybe she didn't have that feminist flair in her. She just kind of went like, oh yeah, well, my family is from feminists. Like if it's coming within genes that, oh yeah, I am feminist because of gene. It's like, for example, I grew up in a family where the woman was the strong person. I grew up in a family with my mom, sister, a brother, and myself, and where my father was pretty much out of the picture. So my mom has to raise 3 kids on her own, basically, and then you have my sister that she's very, very smart, and she's very, very powerful in the sense that like she gets what she wants and she knows how to play the game. And then you have me, that I believe that I'm a very strong woman, and then now you have in contrast my brother, the only male of the family, not being as strong and not being as determined than the woman in the family. So maybe it's a gene thing, maybe Olive have that flair of feminism because of the genes, but the thing that we know is that she's going to school for, I think, psychology. It's not clear in the movie, and I haven't read too much in depth about it.
Again, from a cursory reading, from doing some research, from what I can tell, she was a student, but she was not one of the professor's students. I don't think she was actually in any of Marston's classes. Hollywood streamlines the storytelling to put her in a classroom with Professor Marston, but I don't think that was factually correct.
Bottom line, do I really believe that really happened, that they were lovers as the movie portrays? Like I mentioned before, I don't see Elizabeth being that way. I can see Olive accepting that situation because throughout the movie, you see her being the housewife, staying home, cooking, taking care of the kids, doing grocery shopping.
To my recollection, at no point do they reveal any profession that she ever takes up.
Exactly. So
it's alluded to that she started the life after Elizabeth pushes Olive out of the family, and she leaves the children behind, by the way.
No,
but most
she took the 2 kids.
Right, and they come to visit at various points. But they mentioned that she started a new life, and toward the end of the movie, she claims that she's happy in her new life and she doesn't want to go back to the old life, but they give you no details as to what that life is or how she's supporting herself outside of the family.
Yeah, they go into, at the end of the movie, she makes the statement that the only way she's gonna come back is if she can get a new stove, like a new kitchen, and she wants the kids to be taken care of off during the weekend or Sunday because that's when she wants to read. So that kind of makes you think that she's the full-blown 1940s housewife. I can see Elizabeth being lovers makes sense. Olive, I can go either way. If they're sisterly love and she's just a submissive wife, or it's just like actually just lovers of Elizabeth.
Okay. I'll explain where I came to the movie from. It's difficult not to have some understanding of the Marston situation as a Wonder Woman fan. In particular, I remember when Les Daniels' book, Wonder Woman, The Complete History, came out in the year 2000, which was back when I still had my shop. I remember one of my customers like, have you read the book yet? You gotta check this out. It's so crazy. And talking about their presumed polyamorous relationship, or the very least that Marston had two women with whom he was having a sexual relationship in his household, and that those women all influenced the creation of the Wonder Woman character. I'm a Wonder Woman fan. I don't consider myself some sort of a Wonder Woman scholar. I've got a number of books that discuss Wonder Woman, but I haven't really read her in depth, like the actual creation, all the behind the scenes stuff. And in particular, a couple of books, several books in recent years have really blown up this story. Tim Hanley's Wonder Woman Unbound, The Curious History of the World's Most Famous Heroine. Noah Berlatsky's Wonder Woman, Bondage and Feminism in the Marston Peter Comics, 1941 through 1948. But most especially Jill Lepore's The Secret History of Wonder Woman. All three of those books came out around 2014. So again, there's a ton of recent information, a lot of new stuff that had come to light. The majority of which was, from my understanding, from Jill Lepore's. She's a scholar. She has impeccable credentials. She's an editor for the New Yorker. And she had access to a lot of documents from Harvard and was able to make a number of connections that no one had made before. So she's definitely the foremost authority on Wonder Woman at this point and the history of the lives of the people involved in her creation. But a lot of that didn't get reflected in the film itself. And because I haven't read any of those books entirely, I've read parts of some of those books, I kind of wanted to go in this movie blank. Because since I'm not some kind of a major scholar, and because too often with comic book movies especially, because I know a fair amount about the histories of the comics, both in the continuity and the behind the scenes stuff, it's very difficult for me to divorce that knowledge from the film that's playing out before my eyes. And often it does prejudice my views, and I don't allow myself the opportunity to enjoy them unfettered by that knowledge. So I tried to go into this movie as blank as possible. I figured I could always do research on the back end to check the veracity of it, but I wanted to watch the movie for the movie. And I was okay with the presentation of all the facts until they got to the comic books parts, until they actually walk into the publishing offices of what would become DC Comics for Professor Marsden to talk to Max Gaines about producing Wonder Woman comics. And that's when the movie kind of kicked me right out of it, because I knew all of that was complete baloney. None of that was remotely factually correct. And so it definitely made me, look back and say, well, how much else did they get right? And so leaving the movie, I expected to read a bunch of stuff on the internet that debunked the movie. I was already aware of Christy Marston, is the one you referred to as the granddaughter of the professor. I'm not sure of which mother, though. She's the daughter of Pete Marsden, who in recent years has become notable because he opened the Wonder Woman Museum. He was sort of the face of promoting Wonder Woman history in recent years. He passed away earlier this year, and it seems like, especially in the recent months and leading up to the Wonder Woman movie and this documentary, or this docudrama, that she's kind of replaced him as the face of the Marsden family in relation to Wonder Woman. And she's the one who, right before the movie came out, made a point of tweeting and having interviews with a variety of outlets stating that the movie was a pure fiction. But then I went and did the research after the fact, and it turns out a fair amount of the material presented in the movie is, if not 100% factually accurate, is not a completely unheard of presumption of the facts. And that there basically, you have these two camps. The family tends to favor this platonic ideal of the family dynamic, and then a lot of the researchers and outside observers feel that that is a somewhat naive viewpoint that the family seems to have, because there's a lot of information about the family that doesn't make sense if Olive and Elizabeth are not having a romantic relationship with one another. Even Christy Marsden will admit that while she'd say that she's 99% certain that nothing happened between the two of them, she herself admits that she can't be absolutely 100% certain of that. She just does not feel that in her relationship with her grandmother, who was Elizabeth Marsden, she is the granddaughter of Elizabeth Marsden, because she calls her Grams and she refers to Olive as Dots or Dottie, and she didn't have the relationship so much with Dottie as she did with her Gram. So often speaks with her and speaks to how open-minded she was and how open she was about the realities of adult relations, and she just felt like her Grams would have told her if she'd been in a relationship with Oliver all those years. On the other hand, though, it doesn't appear that either one of those women ever remarried. I don't recall any mentioning of them ever having any other relationships. The Marsden family is noted by pretty much everybody who's had contact with them are very private. Not exactly shocking shocking given the history of that relationship. But to have two women that were in such a long-term relationship with the same man, to never again have a relationship with any other men.
And they living together until one of them died.
Right. That's a very curious thing. It's tricky because the mores of that time, the limited opportunities women had in that time, and the fact that both these women were very progressive, very ahead of their time, or divorced from their times, depending on how you would care to look at it, it could make sense that they recognized that they were never going to find a relationship that was as fulfilling as the one they had with William Marsden and with one another if it were just a pure friendship, and that they probably recognized that they needed one another to support the family that they created and sustained all those years, which would have required everybody to contribute. There's no way that any one of those people could have carried the entire family. They had to work as a unit, and therefore there had to be some spectacular interpersonal dynamics to allow them to exist within the context of the 20s through the 40s. So it's possible that their commitment to the family was enough to where they would not have had a romantic relationship to maintain their partnership in the sustaining of that family. But certainly it would not be at all difficult to read that they all had a connection that was greater than that, and that their love for one another could have also sustained them. Let me put it this way. Tim Hanley, who seems to be the most closely aligned to the family, seems to be the most skeptical about a relationship between Elizabeth and Olive. But Jill Lepore, who I feel has the best perspective and sees the whole story through a broader scope and approaches it with the mind of an academic with a greater wealth of evidence behind her opinions, is very much unwilling to commit to the possibility that that was a purely platonic relationship. She states that that's what the family believes. She herself is not as willing to commit to that. And I think that's because there is a lot of evidence that would suggest otherwise, but there's no smoking gun. It's very much a Schrodinger's cat situation. Is the relationship alive or dead? Nobody's going to open the box. Well, there's nobody alive to confirm or deny at this point. So barring some completely left field revelation, we're never going to know.
Yeah, because if you go into one of the points that they made into the movie is that the kids, they don't know. The kids live into this weird scenario of having two different women for which they have siblings of two different women, but then you can see throughout the movie that Olive is the one who put the kids to bed, and after the kids are put to bed, that's when she sneaks in and goes in bed, not to do anything sexual, but it's just to be in bed hugging just like a regular couple.
Yeah, in the movie it's presented that all three of them sleep together in the same bed, and again it's difficult to dispute that because in the actual Marsden home there was a bathroom that connected both bedrooms so that you would be able to travel between the bedrooms of Olive Byrne and the Marsdens without ever entering the hallway, without ever cluing anybody in as to who was where at what time.
Exactly, and that's what I'm saying, and that's what it alluded into the movie, is that they were having their lives, but they never completely open to the kids, and that's what the movie kind of allude to it. So
not so much open to the kids, but they were accessible to the kids, but they weren't open about their situation.
They were not open, say, well, yeah, your father and you have had a relationship with me, so we're talking about in the 40s. I don't know, in my family, about talking about sexual stuff, it was pretty much taboo. You don't discuss, you don't talk, you don't say anything about sex. Now, I know American culture is a bit different, but I would say that in the 40s or 30s, they still have that being uncomfortable discussing that type of situation with your kids, even though you're a scholar, even though you're a psychologist, even though you write books about, sexuality. It might be a little bit uncomfortable to go into that depth, being afraid that the kids might not understand, or they might find rejection, or they might find like a unbiased against one of the other women. So I can see different scenarios why they probably were not fully open with their kids.
Well, and it could just be a simple matter of loose lips sink ships. You couldn't necessarily trust children to not say the wrong thing and include people in if they're trying to keep the situation private. But another issue is that even if they had a very open and accepting family environment with regard to concepts like lesbianism and polyamory, without the children knowing that their parents were involved in such scenario like that, there's no guarantee that the children would be accepting of that. And I don't know for a fact how open-minded the various children are. They're 4 children plus grandchildren plus their individual spouses. And in most families I know, there's usually at least 1 or 2 members that end up going in the opposite direction of the rest of the family. Yes. And so I don't know what the family dynamic is that would allow for that to be unfurled without it being a problem for somebody. So it would not shock me if the family apparently the three people involved in the core relationship just did not ever spill the beans to the kids.
Yeah, it's just like I say, it's trying to either you don't know what the kids are gonna say in school, like, oh yeah, my parents are in sex with each other, or it's maybe another try to protect the kids too. You know, that childhood, that I guess innocence of the kids at that time. So,
okay. And here's another thing too: is I went into this movie with a bit of an agenda. I basically decided that this is a movie that's directed by a lesbian, a woman, and a woman of color, which is quite the trifecta. So I was disinclined to criticize this woman. Her name is Angela Robinson, in part because to get a movie like this created in the first place, and obviously to come at it from a very personal perspective, I wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt, regardless of how factually accurate the movie was. Again, though, because she had made mistakes on the comic book side of things, I was very curious about what mistakes she might have made in terms of the actual representation of these people's lives. It did not help that her IMDb includes movies like Debs, which is where I was first exposed to her. That was a lesbian spy assassin comedy, but kind of a goofy movie, and that was actually where she became familiar with the story of the Marstons. She had grown up watching the Wonder Woman TV show. She had a Wonder Woman lunchbox, and one of the stars of the movie Debs gave her a copy of a book. I suspect it's the Les Daniels book, and it blew her mind to find out about the three-way relationship and its impact on the creation of Wonder Woman. So for years she wanted to create a docudrama about those happenings, but then she went from Debs to, of all things, Herbie Fully Loaded, the Lindsay Lohan vehicle of 2005. That pretty much ended her film career, and then she began working in television. I believe that she was a co-executive producer on the L Word, which was sort of a spin-off of Gay as Folk. It was basically the lesbian version of that, and that ran for a number of years. She wrote, I think, 8 episodes. She might have directed them as well. She also wrote 6 episodes of True Blood, which you and I watched through to its completion. Not a show I would really take seriously, though. I never took seriously. It's pretty much a trashy show. It was a soap opera. The last few seasons were execrable. Just, I barely remember them at this point. It was a hate watch for us. We just basically plowed through it. And she wrote 6 episodes, many of them in those final seasons. So that definitely made me like, I don't know about this. But
well, let me start saying something. When I went to the movies, I went totally blank. I knew it was about Wonder Woman. I saw the trailer, and even prior to going to the movie, I did ask you, what is this movie? Because the only thing that I remember about the movie was somehow sadomasochism, like submission, and I thought it was going to be more into
some sort of 50 Shades of Grey, bondage, sexy, erotic kind of movie.
Exactly. So that was kind of like me going to the movie, and I remember asking you once or twice. I didn't know anything about the movie. I just knew there was a little bit about Wonder Woman, but I didn't know anything. So for me, going blank and then actually seeing the film, when after the film I came home and I did the research and I found out that it was actually produced by a woman, I was surprised. I was like, well, at least they have that thing right. It was refreshing that the woman, now you are listing all her credentials, and I don't know too much about producer, directors, stuff like that. I'm not into depth like you are, but I can feel throughout the movie that it was just something off, that it wasn't something that a man just directed or
not unlike
produced.
Patty Jenkins' Wonder Woman earlier this year. You could tell the feminine vibe the movie had.
Yes, exactly. Like the more point of view of a woman, the more in-depth sentiment and hesitation and fears of a woman, especially with Elizabeth. There's a few scenes when Elizabeth is trying to act like a jealous wife. Trying to be, oh no, I'm not jealous. I don't care if you sleep with that person or not, or flirt or stuff like that.
I'm not the jailer of your libido or whatever.
Yeah,
she says.
and then you show up like almost in the next scene, and then she's like, "Don't sleep with my husband,"
But this is a PG show. That was not a PG line of dialogue. One of many lines of dialogue that would not get a PG rating.
Yeah, and then you go into when Olive is pretty much throwing herself at Elizabeth, saying like, "Yes, I love you," and throughout the show you can see like I never thought.
And she does it partly as a revelation, but I think partly to diffuse Elizabeth as well.
Well, if you notice throughout the film, and this this is maybe you got the same vibe or not, but throughout the movie, first when they were kind of like her being the professor assistant, almost throughout the film, I thought that Olive was just pure in love with Elizabeth. At any point in time on the first scenes of the movies, I thought that she was not whatsoever interested on the professor.
The two women had a much greater chemistry than Olive had with the professor, and I do agree with you. It did feel a little bit like he was the lech going after Olive, and Olive was the disinterested party, and it wasn't until the scene where the lie detector determines that she's in love with both parties, and everybody's in love with each other, essentially, that it's like, oh, okay, I guess that's where we're going to go with this, because I got the same impression that you did.
Yeah, so it was kind of like the professor was the third wheel. He was kind of like in the background. He was kind of like the important character, but still not into the actual inner circle of this relationship between the Olive and Elizabeth. So when the lie detector was going on, and then they asked Olive, "Are you in love with my husband?" I was like, almost sure that she was gonna say no, and then the lie detector will agree that she was not. But then when it goes into yes, I'm like, oh wow. I mean, throughout the movie, I never saw any hint of that. Like nothing. The most scenes, it was just Olive looking at Elizabeth. Olive was being amazed by her brilliance and being kind of like feel more comfortable towards her, and always have that spike, that spark. Sorry, that spark. And so scenes like that, it kind of gave me a vibe that it was directed, produced, or written by
it was written directed by Angela Robinson,
but a woman, and not just a man, because it has more like in-depth feelings. And I keep telling you this over and over again. I mean, I'm kind of like a little tired of books, movies, or stuff that involves women, that they are written, directed, or produced by a man. That I'm not having nothing against men, but it just feels different, because it's you can
tell that it's not a woman telling a woman's story.
Yes, it's not on the woman's mind and the vision, and that's one of the things. I do equality, man and woman. We are the same, but society through thousands and thousands of years have trained us that our brains work different. We see different things because the way we are treated, the way we are trained, the way we are protected in a way. I mean, I am a very strong woman. I am very, very strong. I'm very self-motivated. I'm, I'm independent woman. Like, I don't like to be dependent for nobody, especially depending of a man. And so, but at the same time, in my brain, sometimes, like, I feel that connection with Frank, being like, cuddle, just be with me, just let me for 1 minute, for 5 minutes to feel that I can just crumble, that I can just take down my guard and say, comfort me. And then it just 5 minutes after that, then I feel strong again, and I go outside and work, and I start kicking guys' butt and say, you're not gonna dominate me just because you're a guy and I am a girl. So it goes that into our brains behaves different than a man perspective of scenarios or different situations are different on how a guy will react versus a woman. And when I saw this movie, I just saw like something was not by a man perspective, it was more as a woman.
Well, one complaint I hear a lot is a couple of big Hollywood feminists are James Cameron and Joss Whedon. And both of those guys have been hot water recently. In the case of James Cameron, it's because he has had a strong negative reaction to the Wonder Woman's movie's success, to the imagery related to her. He sees Wonder Woman as a step backwards for women. As the guy who built up the character of Ellen Ripley in Aliens, and who created and developed the character of Sarah Connor in the Terminator movies. And then you also have Joss Whedon, who has been creating strong female characters since the 90s. Buffy the Vampire Slayer was a very much an icon of women growing up in that time period. And then he recently was revealed that he had numerous extramarital relationships throughout his career, that he appeared to use feminism as a shield against criticism of those relationships, that his defense of those relationships also came out to some very stereotypical negative views of women. All these needy Hollywood actresses, they always wanted stuff from me, and we fell into each other's arms, that kind of nonsense. So these were guys that at a time when women didn't have a voice, they were acclaimed for giving them a degree of a voice. However, Joss Whedon in recent years I've found has gotten a lot of complaints from women feminists, that he just writes a guy and then has a woman play a guy in the script. He's not writing a woman so much. So this archetype of this strong female character often is just guys writing guys that happen to be women. And that what women perceive as being a strong character is a lot different from what a man would see as such. Women have different allowances and different priorities and see strength in different ways and in different manifestations.
Well, and one of the things that, sorry for interrupting, but I don't know, this is me talking as a woman. Like, the way I see guys showing up their strength and their dominance is more like, you know, getting his chest up and being like trying to step on somebody, try to make them feel less, trying to make them feel that they are useless.
Throw out a badass quip.
Yeah, kind of like being always trying to have that insult, you know, over the top, saying that I am better than you and you are nobody, and trying to use that physical dominance, for which me as the way I see it as a woman trying to show their dominance is not through that childish situation. For a woman trying to say yes, you know, you shut up, is trying to more into the mental way, because it is better to not being aggressive but being smart and show them in a very subtle, in a very intelligent way. I can break you without me raising my voice. I can make you feel that you're less than a cockroach without never a smile leaving my face. And you know, I don't have to act delicate. I don't have to act like, oh my god, you're so cute. No, it's just we have a different ways of fighting. We have a different ways of showing men that's not how it's gonna go. And it's not playing about being a girl. It's not playing like our feminist way. But we don't have to go into that. Oh, I'm a macho. I'm gonna step on you and crush you. I'm like, no, that's not how we do it. We do it more subtle, more intelligent way. And I think that's the difference between the dominance of a man and a woman. And that's what I see in a lot of movies, in a lot of books, that when a guy tried to write a woman and try to make her feel that dominance, is like, yeah, that's not how we do it. I mean, yes, we can be very strong. I mean, for example, I took 6 years of karate. I know how to defend myself very well. I know how to box because I did a kickboxing as well. I'm tall. I play a lot of sports when I was young. So, and I have an older brother, you know, that pretty much we fought all the time. So I am not a delicate flower by any means. Like, when the time comes, I know somebody might be kicking my ass. I am against violence and I will not raise a hand, but I'm not gonna just be like, oh, help me. No, I mean, it just, but that violence is not my first instinct. My first instinct is trying to fight in a smart way and more non-violent and more like psychological way. So that's what I'm saying, that men's is like their first reaction is to have that macho attitude and strong and try to fight and use violence. That's not how we do.
And when a man writes a woman in that way, it rings false.
Yes.
But getting back to the movie, what I wonder is if Angela Robinson approached the relationship between Elizabeth and Olive in the way that she did, where she sets up the lack of chemistry to some degree. I mean, once the relationship gets started, you feel more of a connection between Olive and William. But really, the movie is showing you the relationship between Olive and Elizabeth. And for people who aren't familiar with the history, I'm sure it was kind of a, whoa, what a twist, that they're all in love with each other. And more specifically, that Olive and Elizabeth are kind of closer in terms of the romantic love, where to some degree it feels like William has both a libidinous desire for both women, but also has almost like a more platonic love with the both of them, where they're the ones who have the more romantic relationship with each other.
Like the larger connection. Yeah. And that's one of the things that they show in the movie when Olive asks Elizabeth about how that the William and her met, and she was saying, oh, we know each other since childhood, and we've always been like very good friends, and that's how I used to see him as a friend. And then he started asking if I will marry him, and then she was hesitant. So in that whole conversation, what I took is that Elizabeth never had, in the movie I'm talking about, Elizabeth never had like a very in-depth love, like, oh my god, I'm so in love with you, you are my prince and you're my... No, it was more like, he's very smart, we pretty much have the same degrees, we we have a lot in common. It's a mind that it respects me as a woman. And now, as you know, Frank, I mean, that is very, very important for a strong woman to have a man that respects that and see that and come terms with that and don't feel intimidated. And so for a woman as Elizabeth being that smart and that professional that have different master's degrees, to find a guy who sees her as a person, as a very smart person, as a colleague, as a friend. And then, I think that it comes kind of like, okay, so I feel that I love this guy and I'll be okay marrying this guy. And then kind of like their love and stuff like that develop. That's what I got from the movie.
They are very compatible companions.
Yes.
Whereas the relationship in the movie between Olive and Elizabeth is very clearly more romantic.
Yes, it's
and more
passion.
fulfilling.
It's more passion. And I don't know if you got that same impression that once again William was the third wheel. He was just kind of like the guy in the background, kind of like the one with the penis in a sense.
Ducky with benefits.
Yes. So he was the lucky one to be kind of being allowed to play, in the cool group with the cool chicks.
He gets to join in, yeah.
Yeah. And that's kind of refreshing too. And that's when I thought it was like surprised that it was a woman, because when you see a lot of movies that it has that relationship between a guy and two girls, they always portray the guy as
the center of attention, the object of their affections.
Yes, that he's the one who has the dominance, that he's the one who is making these two girls accept each other because they all love me and I am the best of the best and I am the creme de la creme. But in this movie he was in the background. He was like, no, you're here because we are letting you be in here and you respect us and you treat us well and that's why you're here, not because of you. We're not what do you call it with the sun?
We're revolving around your. We're not in your satellite. We're not your satellites. We're not in your orbit.
Exactly.
You're in our orbit.
Yeah, you are kind of like the moon moving towards our center of gravity, not the other way around. And that's why I can see that, yes, it's very clear now that I know that it's made by a woman. So, yeah.
Well, and what I wonder about, too, is I think clearly Robinson could invest more of herself in a lesbian relationship on film than she would be able to invest in a hetero relationship or even a poly relationship. But also by firmly establishing the chemistry between Elizabeth and Olive, if you're going into the movie expecting it to be a love triangle in the fashion that you referred to, and it turns out that it's ending up being, not only is it a cooperative between three people, but the intense, passionate relationship is between the two women, that would be a big twist for you. And I understand that with a lot of preview audiences that are like, oh my, but it's all laid out for you. So it's either a practical concern where you're making sure to set this up so that when the twist comes, people don't expect it, or they may not be seeing it coming, but when it appears, they have to think back and go, well, wait, they really did set that up. Or it might just be that was the greater interest that Robinson had and that was manifest in the production of the film.
Yes.
So let's take a minute and look at some of the actual, factual information related to this. Olive Byrne was in fact the daughter of Ethel Byrne and the niece of Margaret Sanger. Are you familiar with either one of those women?
No.
Okay.
Well, I know because of what they say in the movie.
Yeah. Byrne and Sanger were sisters, and there was a third woman that they partnered with who I believe was involved with the New York art scene, theater, I think, and they've put together the first contraceptive health outlet in New York. I believe it was around like 1916, somewhere in that realm. They were almost immediately shut down. An undercover police officer came in and basically compromised them and got the whole thing shut down. Ethel Byrne ended up in prison, and she went on a hunger strike. She went roughly 7 days without any food or water, which very much imperiled her life. Margaret Sanger authorized the force feeding of her sister to make sure that she did not die, and then she cut a deal with the governor of New York to basically say, let my sister out of jail, and then you're never going to hear from her again. We're going to disappear her. And she abided by that. So it was an interesting situation where Ethel Byrne was clearly the more committed of the two women to the cause. She was willing to sacrifice her life to the cause of preventing back alley abortions that was killing women left and right in that time period, and forwarding contraceptive information to help women to prevent unwanted pregnancies and the consequences that can come from that. But Ethel ends up getting packed off and pushed out. Sanger, on the other hand, at one point fled the country and was operating out of England. Both of them were moneyed and were able to sustain their political agenda for a long period of time. You could argue that Margaret was the more pragmatic of the two, and she's the one that became famous. Margaret Sanger is very well known as the founder of what would become Planned Parenthood and as one of the primary proponents to getting contraceptives to women women throughout the 20th century, leading to the sexual revolution at the creation of the pill in the 1960s. So Byrne is, the daughter of one, the niece of another, and then she ends up getting involved in this very unique relationship. I've not been able to find a lot of information on what her relationship was to either of these famous women in her life, though. But that was factually correct. I believe that was uncovered by Jill Lepore, which is another thing to her credit, and leads credence to her opinions, her conclusions about these various relationships over some of the other people that are involved with this debate. As far as the lie detector, I remember you were seemed to be very amused by the sequences involving that device. You seem to get a kick out of that. The truth is, in my estimation, that the connection between Professor William Marston and the creation of the polygraph has always been inflated, I think in large part by Marston himself. He was working in the same veins as the people who worked on the polygraph. His research may have informed that, but his never worked. His device never worked. And then much of the time, he was the one who claimed to have determined the relationship between systolic blood pressure and stresses that could indicate lying. It was later mentioned by various people that no, it was actually Elizabeth that came up with that. So this is a man who was kind of known to make claims that were spurious, we'll say. He also seemed to really enjoy hooking women up to his bogus device. I can also speak to the polygraph too as a person who's been forcibly hooked up to polygraph machines in the past. There's a reason why courts don't accept them as factual. They are not accurate devices.
Well, no, and that's one of the things that I never been into one. I never been subjected to one, but it's kind of fascinating in a way of, but even if they ask you a question that it will make you uncomfortable, even telling the truth or not, you might get nervous or your body start reacting even though you tell the truth. Yeah. So
actually the research shows that innocent people are more likely to have like anxiety attacks and the like that would give them false positives.
Well, yeah, it's like I do have a lot of anxieties, right? So it's like even within not me saying lies or anything, but the fact of it will be like, oh my God, my heart rate is going to start going on. So I don't think that there is a very accurate, but it's always fascinated me.
Oh yeah, it's definitely a fascinating premise. It's just not factually correct. Another thing is that sociopaths have a tendency to pass polygraphs because they can commit to their lies and do not feel any remorse or any anxiety about the telling of those lies. And it's obviously a very popular tool in interrogation. It's a very good intimidation tool. It's a good way of prying a confession.
Well, see, but even with just that, when I was growing up, I'm the youngest person, right? So the blame, it was always to me. Like if something happened around the house, it was my fault because I was the more like fixing stuff and going up and like being very active girl. So I remember that if something broke in the house and it wasn't me, just right out the bat, I always felt nervous because I knew my mom is gonna come and talk to me and ask me, and if I say no, she would just look at me and for some reason when I started getting really, really nervous, I started to laugh, like in a very nervous laugh, and then I started to laugh and say, no, it wasn't me, but then it's like, yeah, see, it was you because you're laughing, and I'm like, no, I'm laughing because I'm nervous and I knew that you were gonna blame me. So it is the same situation with this the lie detector.
Yeah, basically Marsden has always claimed undue credit for the creation of a device that is not scientifically accurate and is not admissible in a court of law, and has been quite damaging to a large number of people. He's not a credible source, and he's taking credit for something that is not a credible device scientifically. So that's one fruit of a tree of baloney, that related to this character. Some other stuff that's been mentioned is that there is some evidence that Marsden had threatened to leave the marriage with Elizabeth had she not allowed Olive into the relationship. Both as portrayed in the movie and as referred to by members of the family, that doesn't seem very likely that Elizabeth was the kind of person that would have buckled under that sort of pressure. I'm not sure which member, it might have been Christy Marston, who said basically that William had advanced the notion that he wanted to have this relationship with Olive, had discussed it with Elizabeth, and Elizabeth's supposed to have taken like a 6-hour walk and just thought about the possibilities. And the conclusion that he came to is that she wanted a family, but she knew that she would have to sacrifice the career that she wanted to have for that family, and she wasn't willing to do that. She wanted to have a relationship to her family the way a man did. And so if Olive were there to actually raise the children, to be quote-unquote the housewife of the family, knowing full well that couldn't be William because William was just such a flibbertigibbet. This guy, in the movie they try to tell you that he went from job to job in part because of the relationships that he was having that the academia and society frowned upon, but he was bouncing from job to job before he ever met Olive Byrne. He was never somebody who was very committed to any one thing. He was a guy who was always seeming to be an attention seeker, a rabble-rouser. Yes, he was obviously a very vocal feminist, but he was also a guy who liked to talk out of his boo-boo and stir up stuff and create a lot of attention, make really ridiculous statements that he couldn't really back up for the attention, for personal gain. He was kind of a con man. He was kind of a huckster. He was a guy who had all these letters after his name. Although, when he graduated for one of his degrees, it was noted that he really never went to class, just passed his test, but he didn't go to classes. My feeling, based on what I've read and what we saw in the movie as well, I suspect that the real brains of the operation was Elizabeth. I think that she was the determined one. She was the practical one. She was the one who drove that family. And she probably helped him get the degrees that he had and fully earned hers. And she carried him a lot of the time, especially in the 1930s after they started having their relationship. And it wasn't just a matter of the relationship causing problems. It's just that William was not somebody who was bankable as somebody who would bring in money. He wrote books. He tried to break into Hollywood. He was doing advisory work for Hollywood for a period of time in the 1930s. He was constantly trying to find an angle without really committing to the work that was necessary to build a career somewhere. And it was Elizabeth that went to work specifically with the Metropolitan Life Insurance. She did research writing. She edited an edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica and edited various magazines. So when they show her in the movie, she's taking some crummy secretarial job. That's not correct. She had respectable jobs and was bringing in respectable money. I don't know to what degree she brought in money. I'm not sure to what degree Olive brought in money, but Olive was working. She was also writing articles for magazines and stuff.
Oh, wow.
So both of these women were more successful throughout the 1930s than William was. He was constantly going after a dream that wasn't manifesting throughout that decade. They were the ones who were sustaining that family. Moving forward, some other stuff in the movie, they had the character of Charles Goyette, who was the godfather of American fetish art. And they used the meeting of William Marston with this person to show his interest in fetish art and how bondage related to his disc theory, that he believed that there were elemental units in relationships between people. Do you remember what they were? Wasn't it like dominance, submission, inducement, and compliance?
Yes.
And how basically his negative in that was compliance, that people who are compliant are unhappy, but if you correctly induce them, then you can get them to do what you want them to do, and they'll be happy about it. This theory is not something that would ever caught on, by the way, but it's one of the major threads of this movie. It's part of the spine of this movie. And it was this meeting with Charles Goyette that was supposed to not only inform how to employ disc theory and relate it to human sexuality, and which was conveyed in part through the Wonder Woman comic books that were to come, but also all the rope tricks and the costumes that came from this fetish stuff was supposed to have informed the Wonder Woman look and her accoutrement.
Yeah, and they actually show it very, very clear when Olive puts the tiara and the costume, and then they have this light behind her, and then it's saying like, oh, and Wonder Woman is born, and that's kind of like the scene that you're referring to.
Yeah, and there's no evidence that those two men ever met. There's no evidence really that William Marston even had any particular interest in fetish pornography, any of that stuff, or that he brought it into the household. Nobody has copped to any of that sort of stuff. Almost certainly the scene as it plays out never happened. I find it difficult to believe that he would suddenly discover this aspect in his life where he would have been at least in his 40s or 50s before he would have jumped into that. So that seems a little disingenuous. It's also amusing that sequence in particular was heavily promoted in movie posters and the like related to this movie. And Christy Marston pointed out quite rightly that the style of those posters very strongly mimicked the Wonder Woman movie of earlier this year, trying to ride on its coattails. The scene makes sense related to the themes as presented by Angela Robinson in the movie, but totally bogus.
Well, and that's one of the things that I keep looking at you throughout the whole movie. And just to point it out, we went to a function that we were the only two in the movie theater. Mm-hmm. So it was nobody else in there, so I kind of felt a little bit freely because I don't like people talking in the
we're able to talk to one another because it's just the two of us.
Yeah, I was able to kind of say, oh, I'm sorry. And my comment to you about the, oh, I'm sorry, is because throughout the whole movie, so now when I met Frank many, many years ago, me talking about Wonder Woman to him, it was more about a sexual. I knew that Frank was very much fond of Wonder Woman and that he loved Wonder Woman, but I always took it on the early times as a sexual, because he's a guy, a girl, kind of like the same thing as a lot of documentaries and a lot of things were saying that a lot of soldiers in World War II or in Vietnam, they have that comics to kind of like a pornographical thing.
Right.
There where
they were multi-use.
Yes. So instead of the story, be thinking about more in terms of a sexual way of Wonder Woman. And when I kind of mentioned it to Frank about, oh yeah, Wonder Woman in a sexual way, you pretty much like shut me down and say, no. I don't see Wonder Woman in those terms. I see her more mom as I see her more as a motherly figure, more as a woman, like respectful woman, and not just and it's not whatsoever on a sexual way. And throughout this movie, even since like minute one, when they start going into the creation of Wonder Woman, with the bracelets of Olive and having sexual relationships between Elizabeth and Olive and the robe, like throughout the movie, you can see like a very sexual Wonder Woman. Like Wonder Woman was created on a sexual way, and they keep pointing out throughout the movie with the fetish about how Wonder Woman throughout the comics, she's always tied up, or she's always like in a submissive way, or she's always in a sexual kind of situation without pointing out that it's sexual. And then so you have this scene when they met this guy, the submission guy, and they start talking about, oh yes, this is how women like it, and they start roping Olive and Elizabeth like right out the bat. It's like, I don't like that. You don't have to do that. You don't have to submit yourself.
Yeah, Elizabeth
is
saying that to Olive.
Yeah, so she's saying no, you don't have to, and Olive being the more submissive portrayed in the movie, she's like, oh, I don't care, I don't mind, I'm okay with that, And so,
well, ultimately, what silences Elizabeth is Olive says, no, I want this.
Yes, and then Elizabeth, okay, well, if you want this, let me do it instead of William, because I will do it with more care, like with more love, instead of just doing it for like a sexual pleasure. Mm-hmm. It will be more, I want to please you on how you want to play this game. And then, okay, so it was this scene of them being in that place when Elizabeth and William, they're arguing about, no, this is not right, this is just horrible, this is just not a scenario that I want for us. And then at that time, Elizabeth found the tiara and then puts it on, and then just showed it to
Olive puts on the tiara.
Yes. Sorry, Olive. And so she goes into this place where Wonder Woman is born. So like right at the bat, like right there, it's just all sexual stuff. It's all sexual revelation.
I want to point out too how much those scenes echoed a movie from about 20 years ago called Exit Eden, and Dana Delaney's being indoctrinated into, I don't know if that's the word, but being inducted into the circles of BDSM by Hector Elizondo's character. I saw a lot of parallels there. I would have a tough time believing that Angela Robinson had never seen that movie because it felt so similar in terms of the dynamics.
So yeah, so I'm watching those scenes and I keep over looking at you, and I just feel that discomfort. It's like I feel that you are seeing that movie in those scenes, and somehow this is gonna sound like really, really wrong, but it's just like when a son talks sexual stuff about the mom. Mm-hmm. That kind of awkwardness, that kind of uncomfortable situation of like, I don't want to think about my mom being a sexual being, and it's like that's kind of like the son and mom relationship. And throughout those scenes, I keep looking at you and kind of feeling that, oh, Frank is feeling really uncomfortable, and he doesn't like that situation because it's not a Wonder Woman as a strong person, as a very capable person, as a heroine. They're making it more as a sexual object. So what are your thoughts about that?
I don't think that the word discomfort is one I would use in this particular situation. I was more bored. I'm not really, obviously because I don't come at Wonder Woman from a sexual place. I'm not interested in really seeing that aspect of the character. I don't have a problem with her having relationships, just like I don't, another favorite character of mine is Captain America. There's a lot of parallels between those two characters. And, Captain America has girlfriends, but romance really isn't a bigger part of his story. It's really about the action and the ideals and everything else. It's not about him getting his freak on with his various girlfriends and such. I'm not unwilling to acknowledge either one of those characters' sex lives, and I'm not unwilling to acknowledge there's a kink factor to Wonder Woman, especially the early work. That's just not the area that interests me.
I mean, it's not.
So, and again, because of the parallels to movies I've seen before, I was just kind of bored with that part and was just kind of ready for it to be over. It really played long, and I was just kind of like, okay, can we? I know that you have to acknowledge this, but do you have to spend so much time on it?
It is not about the romance and the sexuality of the superhero, because come on, let's face it, it's like she's an adult, Captain America is an adult, so they're gonna have sexual relationship, and they're gonna have romance, and they're gonna have crushes. That's part of life. It's like your mom. Yeah, when you get older, you're gonna think about, yeah, I mean, she's a person. She is a human being with the same things that other people has. But just the idea of Wonder Woman creation creation and not the comics afterwards, but the creation of it. It was more of like just a pure sexual image, and she was created based on that, and that's what I got from the movie. It wasn't created like, oh yes, let's create a comic book about this woman that is a superhero that is very capable just like a guy, that is very smart just as a guy, that can get into fights and can get into all that scenarios and show up her doing the saving and not somebody saving her type of situation. It was more like, oh, she was created in the pure sense of like a sexual symbol, and that kind of little bit to me bugged me a little bit, because it's like you're coming back to the same situation as seeing women just as a sex symbol. Woman is not just sexual symbol. Is a woman is not just a person that you have sexual relationships with and it's just kind of put out with. A woman is totally more complex and more different than that. Yes, it's part of us, but it's not the only thing. And that's the thing that kind of bugged me about that section, and that's what I keep looking at you. So, yeah. Okay.
Well, and another issue is that for a movie that's about creators of Wonder Woman, it spends remarkably little time discussing the creation of that character, and a lot of time just talking about the personal lives of the people related to that creation. And in the areas where they do approach the creation of Wonder Woman in the movie, they do it very badly, I feel. I think that some of the worst stuff in the movie is the stuff related to Wonder Woman. It's a better movie when it's just a romance between these three people. So even though I acknowledge the role that bondage played in the popularity of Wonder Woman in her day, I didn't read the Golden Age Wonder Woman stuff when I was a kid. That's not how I got into that character. I don't think that that's a very sustainable aspect of the character in the modern era, and it's not what interests me. So that's just another element of the movie handling something at length in a way that I just wasn't very interested in.
Well, let me ask you something. So you have not read any of the Golden Age Wonder Woman created by this William guy?
No, I've read some of the stories. I often reference Marston because I've read enough about him to have a sense of what he was trying to accomplish in these stories, and in particular the elements that he wanted to accomplish that I agree with and support. There's other stuff that he was concerned about that I am not.
Well,
I'm not trying to diminish that. I'm not trying to condemn all that. I'm not very interested in it, and I don't know that it's helpful to moving the character forward and having her be an icon for people, and especially women. So I have read a number of the Marston stories. I enjoy the parts of those stories I enjoy, and there are parts of those stories where I just sort of roll my eyes and go, okay, or I kind of want to flip through it and move on to the next thing, because there is so much bondage. There is so much kinky fetish stuff, and I shouldn't even use the word kinky because it's judgmental, and I'm not trying to be judgmental. I'm not opposed to that. It's not what brings me to the table either.
Well, let me ask you this, because the reason why I brought up this is because you know how earlier you were talking about what the lie detector and how Elizabeth was bringing like all this accomplishment to the household. She was the one bringing the money. She was kind of like being the more successful.
She was the backbone of the family, I think.
Yeah, she was like the matriarch. So now the reason why I'm asking if you read comics from Wonder Woman at that time, supposedly written by William, is if you detect any hand of Elizabeth involvement on that, or it was just pure William writing those comics and come up with all those ideas, or do you think that Elizabeth and Olive probably contributed, or they did the writing, or they kind of get into some of the story?
We'll get into that. Let me pick back up then from where we were looking at the historical creation of the character.
Okay.
One of the major turning points for the household and for the fortunes of William Marston was actually through Olive. Olive Byrne had started bringing money into the household by writing articles for various magazines. In particular, she took on the pseudonym Olive Richard and wrote for Family Circle, where she created a scenario where she would basically pretend like she didn't know William Marston, personally, and would consult him about various family problems that she had as a single mother of children and stuff. And then he would espouse his beliefs and his advice and this like. And this went on and on throughout Family Circle. And at one point, that led to an article about comic books, an article called Don't Laugh at the Comics, where Marston said a lot of good things about comics at a time where there was a lot of concern about how healthy and how beneficial comic books were for children, all these people that had been exposed to it. He felt that they had educational value, but he had problems with what he called the blood-curdling masculinity and violence depicted in the comic books. And this article attracted the attention of Max Gaines in part because William Moulton Marston had clearly done his research on comic book people people and specifically name-checked Max Gaines as somebody who was doing comics right, who was doing it the right way and was doing stuff that was beneficial for kids, which gets back to that hucksterism. This is a guy who used his very tangential relationship to the polygraph machine to become a pitchman for Gillette blades and stuff. I mean, this is a guy who is constantly sniffing around Hollywood trying to make money. All these articles, all these scams he's running with Olive. You know, he's got this whole series of articles where she's pretending she's somebody that she's not and seeking his advice. So it seems like a bit of a con, right?
Yeah.
And it really, I strongly suspect that Marston saw opportunity in comics. This was an industry that was booming, but there was very little regulation, very little order. It's an industry built up by young men. So many of the people involved with comics were in their teens and 20s while they're doing this stuff. They were uneducated people for the most part. And then he walks in and starts name-checking specific people in comics like, hey, there's a guy who's doing the job right, and I am a professor at or former Harvard professor, and I have all these credentials. I'm a very smart man. You should listen to me. I know what I'm talking about. And he attracted Gaines' attention by specifically name-dropping him, and sure enough, Gaines brings Marsden on as an educational consultant for what would become DC Comics. But specifically, Gaines had actually basically created the comic book medium, not the comic book medium, he created the comic book as we know it today. He was the guy who figured out that if you folded the newsprint in a certain way and stapled it, you could create a magazine out of newspaper that you could sell that would have a shelf life that wouldn't just be a giveaway in a newspaper. And he's the one who first started getting comic books out into the stands. It didn't work out for him initially, but he eventually, when the guys who did make a really good go of it with comics, National Periodical Publications, the creators of Superman and Batman, or the publishers of them, one of the guys who was related to that, Harry Donenfeld, felt that the National was producing enough books that they didn't need to overwhelm the market, that they had their piece and they just need to maintain. Jack Leibowitz was like, nah, there's still more money to be mined here. So he hooked up with Max Gaines and they formed All American, and they were looking for new stars and new talent. They'd done fairly well with themselves with some characters, the Flash, Green Lantern, Hawkman. But Gaines seemed to always be a person who was trying to elevate the art form. He wanted comics to be more than just gutter trash. Jack Leibowitz was also somebody who raised the bar. He was not somebody who was willing to sell trash to children. He up to a point, you know, he would go for the low-hanging fruit, but he made sure they had educational value. He made sure that they were socially acceptable, that he wasn't making things too lurid. So they had standards, and they were constantly looking to raise the standards, which is the reason why they would have things like an educational board in the first place, and one of the reasons why they'd go after a guy like Marsden to work with them. And if I recall correctly, it was Max Gaines who kind of joked at one point, you know, hey, you think you know how to do comic books, why don't you just come up with a comic book character? And Marsden was like, ho ho, I think I'll do that. And specifically though, he was going to do a hero just like everybody else does. And he has claimed that he was going to do a heroine, but his wife, before she passed away, said that no, I asked him specifically to create a heroine. There's too many guys in comics, create a female hero. Olive's son believes that Olive was the model for the figure of Wonder Woman. She was tall, she had dark hair, she wore heavy Indian bracelets. Other members of the family think that Elizabeth may have contributed because Olive was kind of a rail, where both Wonder Woman and apparently Elizabeth were a little bit more curvy, so it feels like more of an amalgamation of those two women. But especially the bracelets are very clearly inspired by Olive Byrne.
No, and we're not talking about just physical figure. I mean, you know, like if you see Wonder Woman, and you will know more Wonder Woman that I do, but so in physique, and even in the movies they say, you know, in physique and the actual physical of Wonder Woman, yeah, it was more like Olive, but in more or on how Wonder Woman is as a person, as a character on the inside, it was more like Elizabeth, strong, capable, and more kind of like a go-getter type of person.
I tend to think they were both strong women because I think that one of the reasons why
No, I'm saying about based on the movie.
Right. But I also think that what works is that both of these are strong, intelligent, educated women. I don't think that Elizabeth would have let just some random woman into her family. I think she needed somebody that she could see as a peer, somebody she could have conversations with, and they understand what she's talking about. You needed three intelligent people to form that dynamic. I have a hard time believing that these women did not influence the character. It's pretty well documented that William Moulton Marston was very, very hands-on in the creation of Wonder Woman. Again, there were so many young kids who didn't know anything about business that got into comic books and got ripped off. Jack Kirby foremost among them. A guy who was a prodigious talent, created an enormous number of characters and concepts, owned none of them, virtually none of them. Was constantly lied to by businessmen, foremost among them Martin Goodman and his proxy Stan Lee, and ripped off by those two gentlemen over and over again. As much as I have affection for Stan Lee, he definitely contributed to the continuous exploitation of Jack Kirby. The people who whose names you associate with the big characters were usually a little bit more savvy about business. Bob Kane was a young man, but he was fairly savvy. He managed to cut a pretty good deal for the creation of Batman. He also had, if I recall correctly, reasonably wealthy parents, and he was able to scam DC a number of times to get more and more of a share of Batman and more creative control over Batman, even more so than what he had when he signed a fairly sweet deal for the character to begin with. And so Bob Kane, despite rarely ever actually producing anything in terms of story or art, was able to have a whole team of people ghost the book for him and create tons of very long-lived concepts for him and never get a bit of credit. Everything was signed into Bob Kane's name. Joe Siegel and Jerry Schuster had a decent deal after the fact. They were able to kind of they got burned, and then because Superman was a big success, they were able to kind of claw back some money, not very much in the way of rights. Then they got burned again, in part because Jerry Siegel specifically kept making really big mistakes in trying to think that he had greater legal rights and greater legal recourse in determining the fate and the rights over Superman than he actually had. But in the 1970s, DC was basically shamed into giving them some honorariums and a stipend. William Moulton Marston, because he was an intelligent man, he was a man with a law degree who had passed the bar, he had a wife who had the same credentials and had actually used them to a greater degree. He was able to basically lord over these young guys who are running All American Comics and have a much greater creative control and a much greater right share, to the point where, my understanding, and I've talked to some of the creators involved with the character, the Marston estate had rights to Wonder Woman up through to the 90s. And basically they were able to have certain controls over Wonder Woman that prevented National from doing a lot of stuff with the character and basically forced them to keep the character in print indefinitely. And it was only really relatively recently, in the last, say, 20 years or so, that National basically bought off most of those rights and don't have to kowtow so much to the Marsden estate as they once did. He determined who his artist was going to be and dictated to that artist the content of his art in a similar fashion as Alan Moore does with his scripts, where he would basically write a novella that would be adapted into a comic book story. But it also became something of a family environment, because one of his daughter-in-laws would do the lettering on the strip. His sons, particularly Pete Marsden, actually gave plot ideas to him. Pete actually wrote some scripts for him. And it's very difficult to believe that either actively or passively that the women in his life informed the writing that he was doing. Certainly, it's been acknowledged, and it was especially advanced by the Jill Lepore book, how much feminist iconography of the like that Margaret Sanger trafficked in found its way into the Wonder Woman strip. And obviously, Olive would have been a pretty direct line to that influence, but Marsden was always hooked up into the feminist mindset and was very up on their propaganda, essentially. To whatever degree the women contributed, Marsden definitely soaked up a lot of stuff around him, and I think that those influences reflected in the work. Okay, but also his family contributed directly to the stories as well.
But it's mainly the family contributing to the story. I mean, to the creation. It was mainly the males, not too much of the females. And one point, maybe William, show it before submitting it to the final approval. It's like, okay, so are you think this script will be okay, and you don't think that Elizabeth nor Olive said like, yeah, I don't like this part, maybe change it for this, or you don't think that they didn't have like that major involvement, that it was mainly a guy, William, writing one?
I think that Marsden wrote the majority of the scripts throughout the early years. I firmly believe that his entire family influenced the direction of the stories, and I have no doubt that he was discussing the content of those stories with his significant others and his family members, and that they had an influence on the direction. I don't think that they actively wrote very much of the material, but I can't believe that it didn't have a strong influence on the course of that material.
How many people have written Wonder Woman throughout the time? And then I did ask you if it was mainly guys or mainly women. Do you see any change how they portray Wonder Woman? Because
you mean like versus how Marston did her?
Yeah, because you're saying that it was kind of like a family scenario about how possibly Elizabeth and Olive might have helped, or not contributed, but kind of help a little bit on the stories, on the ideas, the son, the sister-in-law. So you have like a different people pitching in into one story, into one comic, and creating what we know Wonder Woman, right? Yeah. Later on throughout the years, you did mention that there's like two other main guys who work on Wonder Woman, and I start to think, it's like, how is it different from that golden age era to the time with this other two guys create Wonder Woman, and if you have any change on attitudes or capabilities or anything to do with Wonder Woman?
The other two main men who charted the course of Wonder Woman's character's existence were Robert Kanigher, a writer-editor who handled the character from the late 40s until the late 60s.
So that is after Williams died.
After he's passed. Not directly afterwards, but, within a couple of years of that happening. He charted the character's course for like 20 years, left for a period of time, then it came back for about a year or so. And Kanigher's material relative to Marston was severely retrograde. You could commend him for being, compared to the general industry and compared to media in general, still maintained a vestige of the feminism presented by Marston. But it was so much less pronounced, so sanitized, so compromised by the mentality of Robert Kanigher and his having a much more traditional view of the roles of women. He probably did the best that he was capable of doing to be a progressive voice for that character, but it's very hard to read his stories from those years and not see it reflecting 50s and 60s white hetero male values, where Marsden was able to speak more beyond his experience and speak in a much more feminine voice
and
than
then
Kanigher was capable of.
That it has some help from another woman. You can sense a woman's hand on his work. He wasn't macho enough to kind of say, oh, I'm just going to write this and it's going to be just mine and I'm going to ask, and I am not going to ask opinions or criticism from other people, especially women. So what I'm picturing is that this second guy, although like you say, he's trying very hard to kind of be the same type of situation to like a strong woman, I picture him in my mind, and I'm not saying this is true, but what I'm picturing is that he was more like, I'm just gonna write what I want to write without asking opinions, especially of women, especially of like showing them, do you think that this is how a woman will react into this situation, or do you think it's too like stereotypical of a man if I wrote this way, kind of be more. So do you agree with that, or do you disagree on your best of your knowledge?
William Moulton Marston was a devout, even radical feminist who was very much aware of their philosophy and their goals. He was a psychologist who employed a variety of techniques to induce people to his way of thinking. He was a person who believed that female superiority, not just equality, but female superiority was the most desirable course for human existence. And in particular, he believed that within 100 years that the United States would be ruled over by a matriarchy of utter dominance of women over men.
Well, we are getting there.
Robert Kanigher was a guy who cashed checks for 20 years, trying to write a watered-down, pale semblance of that philosophy without any strong indication that he had any great sympathy toward the goals of Marsden or feminism. Quite probably consulted wife, daughters, what have you, but it's nowhere near the same thing. And there was very much the sense in his writing and in the writings related to his work that there's an obligatory quality to it all, that DC had to put this book out. They put as little effort as possible into sustaining this book to maintain the rights that they had over the character, and it showed. And so then the third creator of note is George Perez, who took over the character in 1987 at a time where she was at probably her lowest ebb creatively and commercially, and rebuilt a fan base, very impassioned fan base, gave her some degree of commercial clout for a period of time, and his vision of the character has been reflected in virtually every incarnation that followed him. I think to some degree to the character's detriment. I think there are things that he brought to the character that were beneficial. He definitely brought back a feminism that had been lacking in the years since Marsden's departure. He found a way of moving Wonder Woman into a more globalist character, where she had previously been a very American-centric, patriotic type character. He made her more of a global citizen and gave her a more progressive feminism while also stripping her of virtually every vestige of sexuality and reverting her from a woman into something that was closer to a girl in terms of her mentality and approach to the world. So nobody could write Wonder Woman like Marsden. I don't think that anybody maybe should write Woman like Marsden, especially in the modern context. But the spirit of Marsden, if you can recapture that, it's really the spirit of Wonder Woman, and the best Wonder Woman projects take that energy and that conviction to heart and manifest them on the page.
Fair enough.
And the great thing about this extended Marsden family is when I say that, it doesn't necessarily have to refer to William Moulton Marsden. When I say Marsden, I think the whole family contributed, and their spirit is within the character in perpetuity.
Yeah, okay.
But getting into those details too, this is one of the areas where the movie really kicked me out, because Oliver Platt plays Max Gaines in the movie, and he's foul-mouthed and he's dismissive and he seems very broken down and everything else. And as they portray in the movie, Marsden is some down in his luck loser who's coming to DC begging for scraps, while also being like an obvious, like something of a crazy person with this radical agenda that he's trying to put down on a person's desk. It does not portray Marsden very well. It does not reflect any semblance of a reality that's been well documented, and I don't think it reflected the character of Max Gaines well either. But what's also funny is that character is a combination of two different characters, Max Gaines and Sheldon Mayer, who was the editor and of the Wonder Woman strip and the Sensation Comics book that she was published in. He's the one who took Suprema the Wonder Woman and shortened it down to Wonder Woman. And he was a person who was constantly in conflict with Marsden over the sexual content and the kink factor in the book. Sheldon was constantly trying to kind of rein Marsden in. Had some success with that, probably maybe curbed some of the worst instincts of Marsden. And this character is completely absent from the movie. And then the character of Max Gaines, I really had trouble with that because Gaines, again, as I said, was a person who had a certain standard, and he wanted to raise the standard of comics. It's one of the reasons why he brought in Marsden in the first place. He quit comics in one of the heights of their popularity. He sold out his shares of All American because he wanted to start another kind of comic company, which he called Education Comics, which was shortened to EC. And he published books like, I think one of them was called Pictorial Stories from the Bible. So he did a lot of stuff that was like, again, it had educational value, historical stuff, fairly dry material that didn't catch on with the kids. It was exactly the kind of comics that kids didn't want. It's funny because you look at Wonder Woman, which is this fairly saucy book with all these very, adult themes running through it. And of course, this radical political agenda that's very much on the surface of the book. Wonder Woman is constantly espousing the superior order of women and somewhat communistic ideals too about everybody working together to a greater goal and such. And that went over not only with adults, but with their children as well. Children love it. And all that stuff that was above their heads stayed above their heads because there was enough in the stories to engage their attention and make them fans. And in particular, Sheldon Mayer had said that it was an open secret that Wonder Woman was never created for women, that Wonder Woman was created for boys, that the intention of Marsden was to change the minds of boys to understand that women could be their equals or superiors and that they had rights to be a part of the patriarchal world and that he was trying to mold their minds. What's interesting to me about the certainty with which Mayers makes that statement is that a guy who was as cunning as Marsden could very easily have sold that idea to Mayer so that Mayer would be comfortable with the kind of comics they were producing while simultaneously having a whole other agenda that he wasn't revealing. The fact that you have comic creators like Trina Robbins and major political figures like Gloria Steinem read those same stories and feel empowered and basically glaze over at the sexual stuff and only see this capable woman who's having these incredible adventures and espousing all these beliefs about sisterhood, and that's what they take from it, tells me that Marsden was definitely playing to a broader audience than just boys. But if that's what he had to tell Mayer and Gaines to sell them on the idea of Wonder Woman, it sure worked out well. Wonder Woman was a gangbuster success. Marsden at one point claimed that she was selling in the neighborhood of 2.5 million copies of circulation a month. Of course, there was somewhat dubious math there because he was factoring in the Sensation Comics series, the quarterly Wonder Woman book. I think he might have even tried to throw in All-Star Comics when it featured Wonder Woman, or Comics Cavalcade, which only had a Wonder Woman feature in it. But regardless, Wonder Woman was the number one book that All American ever published, below only the upper echelon of superhero characters like Captain Marvel, Superman, Batman. She was one of the only comic book characters of the time to make the leap to newspaper strips, which was the goal of all comic book creators. Comic books was always a stepping stone to get into newspaper strips. If you could get into newspaper strips, that's where the real action was. And even though her strip wasn't a success, in part because the Superman strip and the space that it took up kind of helped to suppress the Wonder Woman strip, the fact that she was even in contention, the fact that she even had a strip at one point shows how incredibly successful that character was. You know, they have that moment in the movie where Marston is trying to sell the concept of a female hero, and the Max Gaines character as portrayed in the movie is like, women are flops, women don't sell. There hadn't been enough women produced in comics for him to have that sort of dismissive attitude, and in fact, there had been some reasonable successes with comics up to that point, so there was no reason to make that statement. It was just an invention for the movie.
Well, I think for me, just to put it out there, and the reason why I just go into this, pretty much that entire part of the movie, to me, was just like, it's just like when you were saying about the whole, when they go into that shop with the rope and all that, it was already like, okay, come on, let's move on and stuff like that. So to me, it was less interesting than obviously it is to you, because to me, it was just like, okay, I don't know anything in the story about this. I don't know what is the actual comic creation relationship between the editor and this person. So I did not took it as such. So just to put it out there, I'm not going to have too much to comment on that sense because I pretty much I kind of like start going into La La Land into when they start going into that detail.
And that's a big problem for me because you never at any point hear mention of Harry G. Peter, who was the artist handpicked by Marston to produce the script, who, again, as very much a different kind of creator than what was normal in the field. This is a guy who'd been doing like editorial strips and since like the turn of the century. You know, he was working back in like 1908 on magazines like I think the New Yorker and stuff, doing like editorial cartoons and stuff. But there was something about his style that Marston liked and brought him into comics because he didn't work on comics before. Neither Marsden nor Peter ever worked on anything besides Wonder Woman strip. It looked completely different than anything else out there. Young guys like the editor Sheldon Meyer was like, why are you bringing in this old guy? His stuff looks almost grotesque. It's so weird. But basically Meyer helped to steer Peter towards a style that he felt was more accessible and acceptable to the modern audience. But this was an old guy. This guy was in his 60s when he started on Wonder Woman. You know, William Moulton Marston is an older guy. And what ended up happening is not only did Sheldon Meyer steer the strip and have a decent hand in guiding this neophyte in William Moulton Marston who didn't know how to write comic books. He wrote stories that were adapted into comic books, in part by Meyer and by Harry G. Peter. But both Peter and Meyer became family friends. They came over, they hung out with the kids. One of the daughters, Olive, Meyer would just like sit on a stool and just let him watch him draw the comic books for hours at a time. And she was just fascinated watching him create. Meyer was always going in, like telling dirty jokes to the boys and playing piano. And after William Moulton Marston died, he lived down the street from them. The kids were always over at his house and hanging out with him. He was part of the family for the rest of their lives, basically, or at least the rest of their childhoods. And I think the movie goes to great pains to show how everybody rejected the Marstons and this terrible secret they had and all these personal traumas that they were having and they're split at the family and all this stuff. And it was utterly bogus. It's such a kind of a pathetic attempt at drama. And
but that's the thing. It's just like they have to have drama, right? So they have to have that, I guess, taboo and saying that it was not socially acceptable. That maybe that's why they didn't reveal it to the whole society on how it was a possible romantic trio and stuff because, you know, maybe it was just a movie to portray that.
But that's just it, this manufactured drama. I understand the cliches demand that be present. Part of what I loved about the first hour of the movie was it's all about the courtship of these three people and how they all come together and how there are elements that are familiar from older movies and classic movies and classic romantic tropes, but it goes about it in a somewhat different way. And for a movie that you're expecting to perhaps be very, perhaps lewd, kinky, you know, naughty, it's actually very sweet, you know, very like warm and inviting. It's not portrayed in any way. I mean, there's obviously
it's
some reservations. Yeah, it's not a dark movie though. It's a movie where these people are recognizing they're doing something that goes against conventions of the time, but there's a mutual attraction. There's a desire to explore this. These are people that are adventuresome people and they have the feelings that they have and they don't want to deny them anymore. And they consummate this relationship in a bit of an orgy on the college campus involving costumes from like some Roman production and stuff, which is a little ridiculous, a little over the top, but given the subject matter.
One of those Roman costumes, and it's one of the things when Olive goes walking into the hallway and start looking at this play, and it's like the Amazons, or it's like the Greeks. So it's kind of like telling you in your face, oh look, this is kind of like a Wonder Woman in the like on the island. This is what it was on the island. So when they were having sex for the first time and they start dressing up. No, wait, no, that was after in the movie, right? When William was dressed as a captain, kind of.
Yeah, that was later on. That was after they'd gone to the fetish club, but it shows a very overt way of showing the influence
of Wonder Woman.
Even though it's funny because at no point in the movie did they ever mention that Marsden was a aficionado of mythology and that there was a lifelong love that he had, and that's what informed the creation of Wonder Woman, not an orgy during a college play. And also, I'm sorry, I have trouble believing even in the 1920s that just because you were a teacher at a university that you would have free reign over the entire campus and could just crash, you know, this play and play with all the props and do all this fornication in the midst of all that stuff.
It was during the night.
So
though. Maybe they're all gone.
I get that the movie perhaps needed to show that consummation of the relationship, but I don't know that it was necessary to the story that was being told. But I loved how normal the relationship is, how there isn't anything really weird or dark or anything about how they're connecting to one another, and most movies would have gone there, and this movie didn't, and I congratulate it for that. And then in the second hour, it feels the need to manufacture all this drama that I don't think was to the benefit of the movie. And in part, a lot of it is that there's a framing sequence involving the character of Josette Frank, played by Connie Britton, who I thought did a great job with it. And basically, she is involved with the Children's Study Association of America, and she is pushing for restrictions on comic books. It's portrayed as though her decision could spell the end of the Wonder Woman comic book and ruin the career and the family fortunes of the Marstons. And her interrogation of William Moulton Marston is what frames the entire movie. And in fact, toward the end of the movie, it's after he's been confronted with his dual life, with the relationship that he has that's frowned upon by society, with his having seen his comic books being burned in mass book burnings as America has turned against the medium of comic books. And then he collapses in the stairwell afterwards, and he's coughing blood into his napkin and all this stuff, and he ends up going to the hospital as a result. And that's the sign of his decline, is inevitable death. And totally bogus. Totally nothing remotely correct about any of that. Josette Frank worked for the company. She worked for what became National Periodical Publication. She was on one of the same review boards as Marsden had been on. She had never liked the idea of Wonder Woman. She had constantly criticized it. She had constantly tried to shut it down, and she was constantly ignored. She still went after the book after it became a success, and so they basically introduced a intermediary named Dorothy Rubicek, who is never mentioned in the movie. She offered some suggestions and basically helped to, act as a middle person to diffuse the tension between Marsden and Frank. Frank is actually a pretty well-respected person. An award for children's literature was created in her name. I look at the award recipients over the years, and none of the books seem particularly interesting or controversial, so I get the sense that she might have been a little bit of a boring white bread type person, but I can't say that for certain without doing more research. But she had no great power, and Rubicek actually went out and found some outside opinions on the character of Wonder Woman, including Dr. Loretta Bender of Bellevue Hospital, Professor W.W.D. Soanes, and they basically reviewed the Wonder Woman book and said, look, there's obviously some kinky stuff going on here, but we don't necessarily see that it's harmful. And in particular, the Dr. Bender thought that maybe it was Frank that was the one who had some problems and some hangups of her own. So ultimately, all that came of that was Josette Frank's name was taken off of Wonder Woman as an advisor as part of that board, and that's all that ever came of that. As far as the book burnings go, that didn't happen until long after Marsden was dead. That happened as part of the overall panic against youth and juvenile delinquency that came out of the 1950s, and how one particular fellow, Dr. Frederick Wortham, had stirred up all these anti-comics sentiment, and that's when they were burning the comics. Marsden was years in the grave before any of that happened. There's one particular shot that Angela Robinson talks people through in an article on the internet, and it's the scene where one of their neighbors who had been friendly with the Marsdens goes into their house with some Tupperware and is looking for them, can't find them, makes her way through the house, opens the door, and finds all three of them, in a compromising position involving some rope. And what she talks about is how so much of the rest of the movie is so warmly lit, like there's a lot of autumnal colors and stuff, and it's a very inviting. And then that one particular scene, as the woman's going through the house, everything's kind of a dingy shade of blue. It's all being shown from the subjective perspective of the woman as she's walking through the house. When she sees the characters, she obviously has a jaundiced view of the activities. And then that leads into the scene with a confrontation between her husband and some other people in the neighborhood who wants to push the Marsdens out of the neighborhood. Their sons are beating up the sons of the Marsdens because they don't approve the lifestyle and all this kind of stuff. And Robinson talks about how she specifically chose those colors, that soundtrack, to show that this was the woman's point of view. This was this moment of condemnation, and all the times that she shows that those moments when the movie gets cold and gets grim, it's because it's being shown from the perspective of the people that are against the Marsdens and against a more enlightened, accepting viewpoint of the world. And I have to commend Robinson. I think she did a very good job with that. But at the same time, it's invented drama. And I think that showing how this family works and showing a more adult, mature look at the family dynamics and involving the family in this would have probably been a better way and made for a better movie. I really enjoyed the first half of the movie, and then the second half, with all its manufactured drama and its obvious historical inaccuracy, turned me off to that part of the movie. I would have been more interested. I know they didn't have to get into all the nuts and bolts of the comics, but they didn't have to obviously and unnecessarily have all this false information put forth. It took me out of the movie, and I don't think that it benefited the movie movie, and I especially had a major problem with the scene in which after the three-way relationship is revealed to the neighbors, Elizabeth pushes Olive out of the relationship and forces her to try to form another life for some indeterminate period of time. Forces the kids to come and visit and separates the family and everything else. A major problem I had with the movie is that Elizabeth, while she is the central figure of the movie, she's the movie does a good job of bouncing between the perspectives of all three of the major characters. But I do think that the strongest character is clearly Elizabeth, and she's the most abusive character in the movie. She's the one who is constantly denying her own desires and pushing out Olive and condemning the family and breaking up the family and causing so much problems, and it demonizes the character of Elizabeth, and I don't feel that any of that was necessary, and I think it hurts the one of the things that's great about the Wonder Woman comic strip as presented by William Moulton Marston is he had a very specific agenda, he had very strong beliefs, and the strip does not sway from those. It's a bullet trajectory. He's just constantly telling you what he wants you to believe and what he wants the strip to be about. It's very clear. It's a straight line, right? And then the movie seems like it's at war with itself, because in the early parts of the movie, even though there's definitely people that have problems with relationship and there's a struggle to get to a point where they were comfortable enough to have the relationship between the three of them, once you consummate the relationship, I just want to see them be happy for the rest of the time, and I want to see them be successful from that point onward. And with all the manufactured drama, it took me out of the movie. It bored me. I didn't feel like it was necessary, and I would have been happy given how sex positive, how non-judgmental the movie was in that first hour. I didn't need that turn in the second hour. I've seen that kind of story enough times. I didn't feel like it was an effective drama. I felt like it was very cliched. And one problem I did have is we've got this issue with appropriation these days, where for so long, white straight men determine what the stories were going to be told. They control the narrative of media and the narrative of our culture. And in recent years, there's been a big push toward letting women tell their own stories, let people of color tell their own stories, let gay people tell their own stories, and so on and so forth. And what's weird about this movie is that I feel like at some point, Angela Robinson is appropriating a straight family to tell her story, a lesbian story. And I feel like a lot of the drama that's in the second half and all the conflicts, it's her pushing a more modern mindset and more modern belief system onto a movie that's a period piece, where I think it would have worked better. Everybody just keeps it down the down low. They're very particular about who knows what kind of relationships they're having. They only bring in people that would be willing and accepting of them. They effectively combat people that would have problems with that. I wish they'd just been more positive for the entirety of the movie and maintained the positive that you saw in the early part of the movie, and not try to create this drama that I didn't feel fit the story that was being told. Probably because of commercial concerns, probably because of second guessing, but possibly because of Robinson trying to create drama in the same way that she did with a lot of her soap opera stuff that she'd done previously. I think the direction of this movie is very good. I think the acting in this movie is very good. I did not have as much problem with how oppressive the score is. The soundtrack of the movie is really in your face a lot of the time, and I saw that, but I kind of forgave it that because Marsden was a creator whose works were turned up to 11, and a lot of this movie is that way as well. So I kind of forgave that. The one thing I couldn't forgive was the writing was not great for a lot of the movie, and a lot of that is covered over by how good the direction and the acting is. But in the second half of the movie, the bad writing comes to the fore in a way that turned me off for the entire most of the second hour of the movie.
Well, no, I mean, I kind of disagree with that because, okay, so I was going to interrupt earlier about you saying on how Elizabeth was portrayed, like kind of like not the villain, but kind of be more of the turned down. Conflicted too, but I kind of disagree with that because Elizabeth, she knows how hard it is to fight for something and try very, very hard and be turned down because she is a woman. Having the same education as the husband and the husband being able to get a PhD. She's trying to get a PhD. They're not letting her. She's trying to be kind of like the center of the house, the backbone of the house, kind of like the more centric, kind of what it will make more sense to how to act, how to behave. So kind of like the brains of the operations. And sometimes you have that in a family type of situation where it's like when I was younger. I was younger, drinking with friends, being like a regular teenager. I finished school. I moved outside my home and I became part of the workforce, in a respectable job, getting money and having my own place to live. Now I have to pay bills. Now I have to be responsible. I have to wake up early so I can go to work. And so when my friends came over, or when I started hanging out with my friends, it was this constant like, yeah, let's go party. And my brain changed. My brain changed to, yes, let's go party, to no, I can't because I need to get up early, or no, no, I'm not driving when I'm drinking because I might get into an accident for which I'm gonna have problems with the law and they're not able to get to work, and then I'm gonna get fired, and I'm gonna have a job, and then I'm not gonna have an apartment, and all this situation. So it's not that she was a party pooper. It's not about this conflict. Oh, you get out of my house, Olive, because the neighbors are pressuring me. But she's more like the responsible person. It's more like sometimes it kind of hurts when think about what society is gonna think of you, and it's not about what other people think of you. It's how you kind of maintain this stability in your life. You get into a point in your life that it's not gonna be like, I don't care what the world thinks. I don't care about anything. I'm just gonna have a good life and party. No, that totally stops. It's like you have no idea how many times I am at work and I want to say what I want to say, but I can't because guess what? It's my work and I depend on that work because that's what is keeping us fed. Well, not keeping us because you work as well, but it's just that responsibility. And that's the way I see Elizabeth, because you have Olive being the housewife in the movie. Now you already established that in the actual life she did work and all the stuff, but in the movie she was portrayed as the housewife. So she doesn't have any other responsibility and she doesn't have any other care but to put the kids to bed, make sure that the kids do homework and do dinner. William guy is supposedly going back in different jobs and stuff like that. As you already mentioned, there's different from the actual life, but in the movie it was portraying like he was not a breadwinner of the house. The breadwinner was Elizabeth. So in her mind, it puts this responsibility. She cannot just flow, go with the flow, or just say like, oh, who cares? Let's do whatever we want. No, now she has to think about my acts create consequences, and the consequences is just not me. The consequences will affect the kids, the 4 kids that I love, that I don't want them hurt, Olive that I love and I don't want her hurt, and William. So she is carrying all this burden. I mean, it's not burden to have a family, but she's carrying all the weight. So by her being portrayed as the party pooper, the conflict one, is not, I think she's more as, I have to keep my head straight and I have to do what's best for the family, even though that means sacrifice for myself.
But that's just it. You've basically attacked your own argument. As the breadwinner, as the pragmatic one, as the matriarch of the family is 4 children and 2 significant others. She named her only daughter after Olive. All 4 of those children have been living in the same household that she to a large degree was supporting.
See, no.
So
okay,
how dare she? How dare she throw out the mother of 2 of the children that she's helping to raise, the woman who's raising all 4 of the children while she's out breadwinning? That's a ridiculous situation to create. There would be much easier. She works for a company.
Hold on.
Yeah.
I do agree on that. And that part of the movie where she actually threw Olive away, I thought it was going to be more of, you know what, I am leaving. But then in that situation, it's like, oh wait, if she's leaving, now
nobody can leave. That's the point. These people committed to a relationship. They committed to a dynamic. They've raised the family in this dynamic. It is a deeply immature mindset to think that you can just push 3 members of the family out based on, one problem. You can't. Once you're in that situation, you can't break that situation up without being the bad guy, without being the villain.
I agree.
You can't do
that.
Especially if you're the breadwinner, especially if you're supporting everybody. If Olive has sacrificed her life to raise your children, you can't be like, well, you've got to go. And that's a point where Robinson is writing something that you could do in 2017 that you could not do in 1945. You cannot create that situation because it's too precarious. Everybody is too interdependent on one another. You've got to factor, those are her children too. And she's going to send 2 of her children off to live at some bizarre circumstance, and it's not reflected in reality. That's not something that happened.
In that sense, I do agree, but just only on that scene. You did mention multiple parts of the movie where she's the conflicted one. In that part, I do agree that what she did was wrong. In my mind, the best situation is that the guy leaves. That for me would be the best.
That would actually make the most sense. That would have made the most sense. Honestly, you're right. Is you could throw the guy out, because they threw the girl out, I realized what Robinson's doing, and she's trying to test the relationship between the 2 women, trying to test that aspect of it, because the conflicted relationship is between the 2 women in Robinson's mind. But I don't think that's it's appropriate to our times. I don't think it was appropriate to the story. It's not a reflection of the history, and it demonizes Elizabeth in a way that I just think is harmful to the movie's narrative. And a movie that's being so positive about these different lifestyles, to throw that under the bus and to throw Elizabeth under the bus, I found that very distasteful.
But then we have the same situation with Olive. I mean, you just tell me that in real life, she did all this work too, that she was very capable woman. In the movie, they just portray her like a very typical submissive woman that stayed at home. And that, to me, it was like the least interesting character and the one that kind of pissed me off the most, because it's the woman who is accepting the situation, that is accepting leftovers, that is accepting to be, helped by these two wonderful people with master's degrees and PhDs and smart people. So they, for the entire movie, they portray Olive as a, yes, I will do whatever you want, master. Oh, yeah. And until the very, very end of the movie, they kind of like, well, I'll come back if you guys do this and you guys do that.
And still
then
a Holly Homemaker stuff.
And then you have Elizabeth kneeling and being like, oh, please come back. But it wasn't until the very end. I mean, that scene kind of bugged me because, like you say, they come back with the same thing, coming back to be this submissive woman. And that's, for me, that character was most insulting than Elizabeth. Yeah, on that scene when she kicks Olive out, I got a little bit, what? You just kick the guy out instead. But the rest of the stuff, it was good. But for me, the most offensive was Olive. But now I have to put myself in a situation of the 1940s and the 1930s on the 1920s, for which, to me, the movie throughout, and I do agree with you that the movie throughout, it didn't feel like the 20s, 30s, or 40s. The only thing that felt like the 20s, 30s, and 40s was how they were dressing. And that was it. The way they talk, the way they behave, it was like a 21st century. And that's one of the things that you have to realize. Sometimes you can say, well, you don't know how that woman behave. It's not different from the woman now, from the woman back then. And I kind of disagree on that, because unfortunately, women behave, and men as well, behave based on where they are demographically and the time period. And that's, if you go to other parts of the country that they don't have the Western culture, I mean, you can see differences in women. I mean, in terms of my mom, as I mentioned before, I grew up with not a father figure, but it was my mom raising three kids. But at the same time, I see her being a regular, person, being from the 60s, being like a 20s or so in 1960s, and being in Mexico, and just the way she behaved. And sometimes, to me, when she says something that I don't agree on, because I'm a very strong female, and I kind of get angry at my mom for thinking about those situations, but then I have to step back and say she was in a different time frame. She was educated differently than I am right now. I mean, I gained my total independence when I was 22 years old. That's saying like absolute total, I don't depend on nobody independence. So for her, it was like she got married, she was totally on the family, and then got married, and then it got problems, like all the situations. So the life situations are different. That's why we think of differently. So the way I see it in the movie is that everything in the movie didn't feel like the 20s, 30s, and 40s. It felt like somebody from the 21st century just going into a costume party. And that's what I didn't like about the movie.
It was sloppy, lazy, inaccurate, and willfully ignorant writing. And in service, it diminishes Elizabeth, it diminishes Olive to create a conflict that's unnecessary and damaging to the characters and to the story. I take great exception to that. I really have a lot of problems with the second hour of the movie. I put the blame squarely on Angela Robinson, the same way that if you're going to write about a black character, a Muslim character, anybody who's not you, it's a big push now. You gotta, if you're not that and you want to write about that, you need to pass it by somebody who is. And I feel like Robinson wrote to her own experiences and her own interests, and she never passed this thing around to somebody else to check. And she cast well, she directed well. I don't think she writes as well as she would need to pull off this work. Especially, and I'm sorry, but looking at her IMDb, the stuff that she's written, the stuff that I've seen her do, she needed to let another writer take a pass at this, and she needed to have a writer who's had a different experience from her take a pass at that. So if there's one area where I'm very willing to strongly criticize this talent on, it's in the writing, particularly in that second half.
Yeah, the first half to me was interesting. It was entertaining. I wasn't never fully engaged watching the movie, I mean, engaged in the fact, like, oh my god, I'm having such a good time of the movie. There's some of the parts that I was kind of bored and kind of out of it and start thinking about work, thinking about something else, but they actually lost me when they start talking about the going into the publishing of the comics and the whole family dynamic of it. That kind of lose me. I mean, I'm not gonna say that I really enjoyed the movie. I thought it was interesting, and in fact, on how they played the first part of it with the whole love triangle, like that tension between all three of them. But then on the second half, I do totally agree with you that it was kind of boring to me, especially when they go into the more historical part about Wonder Woman that I don't know how to criticize because I don't know the history as you do. So to me, it was just not that interesting.
A couple of things I wanted to touch on that we didn't quite get around to. One argument that Marsden made was that all the bondage that you see in the comic isn't necessarily about a sexual connotation, but was in fact an alternative to fisticuffs. Instead of people fighting and having this violent physical confrontations, you'd have people get bound up. And I think that's almost reasonable. You know, I mean, I'm not saying, I think that it's too dominant, and I do think that it's too much of part of the appeal of the strip to a lot of people, particularly the GIs. But I do think that there is a valid argument to be made that, you know, all the bondage is in those comics as an alternative to the violent confrontations in the boys comics. You know, that is a viable alternative. And it's still exciting. It's exciting probably different parts of the brain and the body that the other violence would impact on.
In most of the comics of Wonder Woman, when she's tied up, she releases herself all the time, so there was somebody saving her.
Sometimes she released herself, but oftentimes it was her female friends that would be saving her.
See, and
like Etta Candy, the Holiday Girls, and the like.
And that's kind of like goes into what we were watching the documentary that you mentioned earlier that we're gonna go on, but it was talking about how women, they're always portrayed like in peril and they needs to be saved, and they show several images of women being tied up on the rail tracks or being tied up and trying to be safe or jump into the window and be saved. So in this case, the way I see it, and now this is just kind of like right off the bat, but the way I see it, Wonder Woman being tied up and she releases herself, or another female helping her and not a man, is kind of like, oh look, I'm in distress, I am tied up, oh wait, I can do it myself, I don't need no effing man, you know, to help me. So that's the way I see it. Now, I don't know too much in depth of the actual comics and because I haven't read at that time on the bondage thing, but that's how I see it right now.
When you're asking about the influence of women on the writing of the book, some things I wanted to point out was that a lot of the artwork was actually generated by women. That, you know, H.G. Peter was an older gentleman, and there was an enormous amount of work in creating all those Wonder Woman stories, especially at the height of her fame. So later, as the script progressed, Peter would mostly just draw the figures, especially the Wonder Woman figures, and he had a team of assistants, mostly young, attractive women. So, you know, probably a side benefit there, who were doing the rest of the artwork. Also, what's worth noting is that Marsden, when he got sick in his last years of his life, he actually developed adult polio. And so when you see him walking off in the movie, he was in a wheelchair by that point in his lifetime, so he wasn't walking anywhere, and he ultimately died of lung cancer. But because it was a slow, progressive descent until his inevitable death, they point out that he was a workhorse, that he was committed to the project, that he was working right up to the end, but he did need help, and toward the end, he hired Joy Murchison, who was another very educated, very accomplished woman, to be his secretary and co-writer. She basically either finished his scripts or did complete scripts of her own to make sure that the book was produced, and she was the one who actually bothered with all the typing and stuff. He would like dictate to her, and she would like help to get the book produced, since he was so heavy into the production of the book and, you know, as far as delineating exactly what was going to happen. So she was a big part of the book at the end.
I wonder how Elizabeth and Olive felt about that. I mean, seriously.
Well, at that point, he was probably pretty close to an invalid, so I don't think there wasn't a prurient interest in having this additional woman in the...
No. I'm not talking about sexual stuff. I'm just talking about, so you have this two women very capable of helping him, very smart, and then he has the need to get somebody else outside their circle, outside of what never helped, to do something that they can be able to do. And it's kind of like, yeah, I don't trust you guys. guys. I'm just gonna go with this third,
I don't think that's
person.
fair because Elizabeth was still working the entire time. She held her job, so she was full-time worker, and Olive was raising the kid. So she was keeping up the household, so she wouldn't have had time to spend all this time working on the Wonder Woman strip as well. So I think that there was a legitimate need there. One thing that Wonder Woman did that a lot of other superhero strips couldn't do was after the war, toward the end of the war too, a lot of comic book superheroes bit the dust because there was an increasing lack of interest in superhero stories. Marston was able to transition out of the war years by having a more fantasy-oriented storytelling, and the book just had a more inherent appeal and a more distinctive flavor than most superhero comics. So where most of the superhero strips were getting canceled around 1948 or so, Wonder Woman, continued on indefinitely. She was one of the very few characters that survived uninterrupted publication throughout even the worst periods of the comic book industry, and was still quite successful. As a matter of fact, she was very successful right up until the end of his life. And that was actually one of the major problems, was that once he died, and both Sheldon Mayer and H.G. Peter both commented on that, the worst thing he ever did was die, because nobody could produce Wonder Woman stories like he could. Sheldon Mayer tried for a short period of time. He knew that he couldn't, and he was tired of being an editor anyway. He quit and started working on his own comic strips. And then Harry Peter continued to work on the book, I think until his death, or at least until his retirement. And they just couldn't recapture the magic that Marston had brought to the feature. The success was so hinged on Marston that it just couldn't keep up with that, and became like kind of a dog for years and years because they just couldn't maintain. I think it's worth noting that the final story that Marston did, and Les Daniels in his book very beautifully illustrated this, you'd like to think about writers and creative people on their deathbed being surrounded by the creations, and to some extent Marston did that himself, because his last story was Villainy Incorporated in 1948, which was basically all of Wonder Woman's villains all coming together for one great big final story, which is considered one of the better stories ever created in the Golden Age. It's the one that's been oft reprinted, and in fact, as the podcast progresses, I'm going to try to cover each one of the villains in that. And now that we're outside of the 75th anniversary of Wonder Woman, I'd like to spend the 76th focusing more on her villains and showing where they came from. So kind of a nice end-off there. To add some validity to the belief that Olive and Elizabeth had a relationship together, Elizabeth is noted for her love of sapphic poetry, and Sappho was, of course, known for her lesbian writings. Finally, I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about the cast. What did you think about the cast on this movie?
Well, to be very honest with you, and you know me for a very long time now, I am horrible with remembering names on actors, actresses, producers, directors. So I don't remember ever seeing any of those characters in other movies, and if I have, I don't remember. I will say this: I love the character of Elizabeth. I think that the actress did a very good job. She was very, very appealing, beautiful girl, very strong. She actually portrayed like the strong that the character required.
I will say that Rebecca Hall has been threatening to be a crush for me for a long time, and this movie kind of sealed the deal. I loved her. I loved looking at her. I thought she was so beautiful. I thought the character she portrayed was so appealing, somebody I would totally be into. Given her accomplishments and her strength, there are definite parallels to you as well.
She did a really good job on her character.
Excellent. Yeah, she really sold the story. I
just kind of forget her about anything else she did, and that's what I think about movies and me. Unless it is like a very famous actor or actress that I can recognize, but for the most part, I just don't see him as an actor, as an actress. I see it as the actual character portrayed in the movie itself. So that will kind of bring me into the movie and not just think that it's a Hollywood or other studio creation. So that's why I'm kind of I'm very bad with actors. So I love Elizabeth. I thought she was great. I had the problems with Olive. Olive to me, but maybe it wasn't too much of the actress type of problem. I think it was more like her portrayal of a woman, a submissive woman, and something that, is for me, it's like, come on, you have to do better than that. Don't just be like that. Don't fight and scream and that. So I think in that way, I think she did a good job, because I actually, if she was trying to portray the submissive character, she did a good job because I dislike her. So maybe she did a good job, but if she didn't try to portray that type of character, then it's like, you did it the wrong way. The guy...
Oh, before you carry on. So you're talking about Bella Heathcote, who is an Australian actress. Ironically, the other thing that you would know her from was the last time that we went to a movie that absolutely nobody else was in the theater but you and I, The Neon Demon. She was one of the mean girls in that movie, and she was actually the final girl in the movie, which I thought she did a good job because of all the actresses in that movie. At the end of the movie, she was the one who was, I suppose, the most sympathetic. She's going through some stuff at the end of the movie that I don't think any of the other actresses would have been as able to portray, because you have a sympathetic feel for her. She's got expressive eyes, and she does have a presence where you feel bad for her, even though in the movie The Neon Demon, she's playing a pretty horrific character who does some very evil things, but you're still feeling for her by the end of it. I think she's a very beautiful woman, and I think that she did a good job portraying a character that was not especially well written and not especially well rounded. I think that her presence gave that character more life than was on the page.
Yeah, the guy, William, he pretty much was to me like the third wheel. There's sometimes it kind of bugged me because it acted so much like a guy, like a macho, or just didn't comprehend that, feminist guy. I leave with a feminist guy that is you, Frank, and I know how feminist guy behave, and I know how they react to different things, and this guy didn't sold me to that. This guy didn't.
He's a little smarmy. He couldn't help it seem like
sometimes
angling. He felt like those other feminists where it's like, yeah, I'm a feminist because it's going to get me laid, So,
so
you did give a little of that.
It felt that he was trying so hard to be a feminist on the script, but it didn't come to a believable characters. Once again, is because I live with the feminists and I know how they behave, I know how they react. So to me, I was like, this guy didn't care too much for him, and he was always kind of like in the background, the third wheel. That I don't care about your story. You're not that interesting. So yeah.
Luke Evans has been kicking around Hollywood for a while. He was in the villain in one of the Fast and the Furious movies. He was in Dracula Untold, the first attempt at launching the Universal Dark Universe of horror characters. When that flopped, they put out The Mummy, and now they're looking for a third reboot of that franchise. I've never been super impressed with him. I thought
he was mainly on macho movies.
Yeah, macho movies. I think he's a handsome guy. He's well built. He's good into action vehicles. So I didn't expect a lot from him in this movie, especially because he's such a stereotypically handsome, lead actor guy playing a character that, playing a real life person that looked nothing like him. So I was actually impressed by what he brought to the role, because he had this sort of contained physical presence. Like he moved in a very deliberate way, and he was able to convey like a sort of an age and a lack of dexterity. He was a guy who felt like he was some kind of like an academic who wasn't very capable. There's that sequence where he tries to get into a fight with one of the neighbors and gets his head handed to him. And he spoke in a kind of an interesting, effective way because he's English, I believe. Sometimes it veered into caricature. Like there's a moment where he's talking to his son after that fight where you felt like he was sort of like maybe taking it a little too far and kind of being cartoonish. But for most of the movie, I thought he did a good job of conveying a guy who seemed a little bit older and a little bit less capable than he would be in real life. So ultimately, I liked the performance. I thought he did a good job with it.
The core of that is to portray a guy that is a feminist, that is creating something for the women, that believes that women can be strong, and I never thought of that. I never believed that out of his acting.
But I think part of it is in the script too. I think that a lot of I felt like Robinson herself in the writing was sabotaging the character and minimizing the character's beliefs, and certainly in bringing in a guy like Luke Evans, he looks like kind of a tchotch douche kind of dude. I thought that he did a really good job given what he had to work with and given how little he had in common with the actual human being that he was portraying. But I see where your point of view, and yeah, he doesn't get that element across. He doesn't get across the feminist zealot, the champion of ideals that Marston was. He gets too much of the lurid, Hugh Hefnery, quasi-feminist exploitation thing. But I thought he did a decent job with it. And I have to say, as much as I've been critical of the movie and its factual inaccuracies and its agendas, I think that regardless of the truth or fiction, I think that the movie itself is important. I think it is entertaining. I think that what I'm reminded of most is back when in my sex shop days, a movie came out called Secretary. It stars Maggie Gyllenhaal and James Spader. And it's a movie about bondage, a relationship about BDSM. I was excited to see that movie, particularly because I was a big fan of James Spader, because I thought he was going to be cool and dark and edgy. And so when I saw the movie, it was too saccharine. It was like too soft and sweet and too much like a stereotypical American happy-go-lucky romantic comedy kind of thing. I thought it was like very like rounded off all the edges and stuff. So I was kind of not into it. But in particular, at the shop I was working with, there was a lesbian couple who was into BDSM. And there was also another woman who worked there that was straight, and she was into BDSM. And they all loved the movie dearly. And I was like, it's just okay. It was kind of wimpy. It was kind of weak. But I think they embraced it in part because it wasn't trying to show the dark, edgy side of BDSM. It was showing that it can be sweet and natural, and it can be part of just like a normal, loving relationship. And I think also about a few years later, I was working at a sales job, and there was a black dude who was talking about the Tyler Perry movies. And I'd, of course, heard a lot of things disparaging about those movies. And I kind of asked him about it. I was like, people kind of talk some trash about that. I mean, what do you think about that? And he's like, you got to understand, there really isn't a lot of movies out there for us, that's made by us, for us, that speak to us, in the same way that you're talking about how you can tell when a woman is writing and directing a movie versus a man writing a woman, in the movie. And Secretary, and I think this movie as well, they're all speaking to a marginalized community, people who are not well served, who do not have a lot of media created for them. And so when they have a voice that speaks to them with verisimilitude, that speaks to them from the same place they're at, it resonates. And even if it may be not the most perfect, most ideal representation, the fact that it's even representing them at all and representing them in a positive light and representing them as something that wasn't othering them, I think that's important. And I do think that polyamorous relationships are the future. We've kind of played with that back in the 60s, all the free love and stuff, but I think that the demands of the patriarchy and the exploitation of all that free love stuff countered that. I think that a lot of the people that are coming up in modern times, to some degree millennials, but I think the generation that's coming after them more so, especially in the social media environment where there's so much more of a lax attitude and so much of a laissez-faire look at non-binary relationships, gay, straight, trans, poly, gender non-identifying. It's like people are just a lot more accepting and a lot less rigid about what kind of relationships you should have. And there's this sense of possessiveness that comes with one man, one woman, or one woman, one man, that is very narrow-minded. I think that the future probably is people who come together that are compatible, and maybe it's two people, maybe it's three people, maybe they're gay, maybe they're straight, maybe they're bi, but it just doesn't matter as much anymore as long as they're loving and supportive of each other and they're able to sustain relations. And especially in times like, us growing up in the Generation X, where we've watched the disintegration of the nuclear family and seen the fallacy of it and seen the abuses that come from that. I think that the people that are coming up after us need to see positive representations of polyamorous relationships. This is one of the first and a very rare example of a movie that's absolutely in favor of it, absolutely loving towards that perspective and supportive of it, and shows that it can work and that it can lead to long-term success of a stable, happy family. I also recall that Sheldon Meyer in particular kept talking about how he would go to the Marston family and in real life and see how well-adjusted and happy and healthy they all were, how supportive they were of each other. If anything, he commended them for being a superior family to other families of the time. So regardless of how truthful it is, I think this is an important movie. I think it's going to mean a lot to people. It's unfortunate that it's such a box office disaster. The thing made less than $1 million in its opening weekend. It made less than Inhumans, but I think that it's going to find life on cable. I think that it will probably find converts too. I think that the movie may end up having the sort of impact that a lot of early pioneers of different lifestyles embrace certain movies and recall them fondly. I think that it's very well directed. I think that it's very well acted. I think that the chemistry of the actors and the overarching story that they're telling is more important than the nuts and bolts and the individual aspects of it. And I love that in a year, as much as I like the Wonder Woman movie, it was so, safe and sterilized. And I think a lot of the kookiness and the nonconformity that was inherent in the work of Marsden was excised from the Wonder Woman core movie. And so I'm grateful that this movie exists to kind of encompass all of those, radical ideals and all of that fun, unusual life paths.
Only the first part.
But more in the first hour. The first hour, I was thoroughly enjoying it. It was in the second hour that it lost me, but I think overall it's a good movie. I do think that people should see it, and I do think that it'll be important going forward.
Yeah, I'll say I like it, but I wasn't crazy about it, but I will give it a 6.5.
Given how long this episode already is, I will not be reading comments this time. We'll knock that out next time. But thanks go out to the 108 Sage, Allie Batts, Dr. Ange, Ascani's Son, Bill Bear, Blue Girl, Brett Brock, Brody's Kitchen, Chris Sheehan, Comic Book Vault, Comic Reflections, Debache, Derek William Crabb, Dmitry Pimenov, Dr. G, the Man of Nerdology, Don Leibold, Ed Moore at Indie Comics Fan, Marvel Bronze Age, Miskatonic, Teal Productions, and Urban Fantasist, Fanholes Podcast, Felipe Alves de O, Glenn Hinutu Heel, Gord Tolton, Grant Richter, I'm the Gun, Jeffrey Brown, Jim Canada Daredevil, Joe Crawford, John Miss the J, K, Keith G. Baker, Kenny Craley Jr., Mark Danvers, Michelle Fife, Min, Paul Hicks, Paul K. Bisson, Pietro Blacksamoff, Punch Like a Girl Podcast, Rob at Speculum Fight, Rad Adventures Podcasting Network, Randy Caldwell, Resurrections and Adam Warlock and Thanos Podcast, Sarah Russell, Satin Tights Podcast, Sean Phillips, Terrence Castanguay, Trekker Talk, Warlord Worlds, Wild Dog Podcast, Will Fish, Wonder Woman Warrior for Peace Podcast, and Xenozoic Xenophiles. Wonder Woman is the copyright of DC Comics Entertainment. This is a non-profit fan-produced podcast. No infringement of any copyrights are intended, and where copyrighted material appears, it is believed protected under fair use. If you enjoy the show, please feel free to leave a comment on the Diana Prince is the New Wonder Woman blog, the Rolled Spine podcast blog. Write to me at emailofdiabolu@yahoo.com, featuring 2 underscores, or just hit me up on Twitter at Commander Blanks or at Rolled Spine. Thank you for listening and have a wonderful week.